Hi and welcome to this video where, as you can see from this camera, the timing belt is now back on and the engine is now rotating again. So in this video I replaced the camshaft seal. I then obviously put the timing belt back on. Now there is some controversy over this because I'm reusing the original timing belt, which technically people would obviously say don't do that. The reason I'm doing that is because it's only done 11,000 miles and it's about 2 years old. Now I have to weigh up as well with this car whether it's actually going to work at the end of the day, whether it's going to pass an MOT, because I have no idea of the history of this car, and also the costs. So on that reason, or those reasons, that's why I've put the original timing belt back on. And all being well, I can always change it at a later date or keep an eye on it. So the timing belt's on, the tensioner has been put back on, again the same tensioner. What I've done there is to adjust the tensioner to where it was when I took it off. So I've not put it into the position for a new timing belt, I've put it back to where it was. So the timing belt's then back on, and also I've put on the crankshaft pulley. A bit more controversy again there, because that bolt should be replaced. Because I believe it might be a stretch bolt, because you do an angle tighten on that, which is normally stretch, and so you normally put a new one on. And again, I've reused that bolt and just not tightened it as much. Probably not ideal, but like I say, for the same reasons as the timing belt, I've put it back on. So basically that's what's in this video, and obviously the engine mount is also back on. So if you find this video helpful, which I hope you do, I would appreciate it if you could like and subscribe to the channel, because that obviously helps promote the channel and keep things going. So anyway, yeah, so that's what's in this video, and many thanks for watching and have a good weekend. So I'll start by removing the engine mount for better access. So now I've learnt my lesson about dropping things into the engine, I am going to cover it all up with a bit of pallet wrap there, just to make sure it's safe, and then put a few ice hockey pucks on there just to keep that tidy. Okay, so we'll get our trolley jack underneath, because obviously we need to support the engine again, because we're going to be removing that engine bracket so that we've got better access there for doing that timing belt. So that's a 13mm socket, just to whiz these 3 screws out, take that sort of bridging bracket off, and this hydro bracket that's mounted on the body. So we just take this bracket out. Technically probably don't need to, but I want to try and give maximum access for camera. So okay, so we'll start by fitting a new camshaft oil seal. So here is the new seal, and there are instructions on the packet, and I think it's best that I actually show those. So you may want to pause that to read those for a bit longer. So basically no oil must be put on this seal. And it's probably a good job they actually said that, because I would have probably started putting oil on it, or red rubber grease or something silly. So sometimes it is good to read the instructions. So it comes on like a cone there. That's like a protective cone, so we just push that on. It's quite stiff. I'll just give that a gentle tap with a mallet, just to make sure that's fully seated, because I don't want to damage the lip of the seal when I push that on. And then it should be a case of just evenly pushing, and there it is. It's hopefully home now. Now I'm just going to use a 32mm socket, possibly one a bit bigger might be even better, just to gently tap that in. I don't want to tap it too hard and damage it. So hopefully that's in like it should be. Okay then, so now to refit the timing belt inner upper cover. There's a couple of photos of that just to show you what the cover looks like. And there it is, and our cam sensor hole, and a little plastic bracket on the edge there. So I've removed the plastic bracket just to show it, and then I've just clipped it back on. Obviously that would normally be on anyway. So we just pop that back into position, and we'll get our two other screws. One stays in there on the left hand side, and then we just tighten that far back one up with a 7mm socket, and that's to 6 Newton meters. And the other two screws ironically are slightly larger, and I think they're an 8mm socket. Yep, they're 8mm, so just tighten those again to 6 Newton meters. So it's basically just hand tight. There we go. And then we can just clip the connector back into that bracket like so. So the next job then is to refit the camshaft sensor and camshaft sprocket. So here is the camshaft sensor. So that just pops in there. So we have got to do a little bit of measuring in a minute. So just do this screw up with a Torx 20. Do it lightly for the moment, because we need to actually adjust this backwards and forwards. As you can see, there's quite a bit of play there, and for good reason. We've got to get the spacing between that and the camshaft sprocket just right. So there is a photo of the camshaft sprocket showing the lug. So we'll just make sure the lugs line up. So I think the 3 webs are magnetic for the camshaft sensor, because that's what it's got to be near, is to those webs. So we'll pop the bolt back in again like so, and then we'll have to use the sprocket holding tool, which I'll put a link in the description to that. Like I say, this one was only about £20, so for £20 it's well worth getting hold of one of these. Just make sure you do it for the correct orientation, whether it's tightening or untightening. So what we're going to do is initially tighten this to 20 Newton meters. So like I say, make sure you put the tool together in the correct way to hold it for when you're actually trying to tighten it and not undo it. So I actually had to readjust this. There we are, there's our click. Right. So the next thing is now an angle tighten of 50 degrees. So a little bit more tricky now, because these things seem to always want to fall off. So you've got to try and hold that there, stop that protractor moving, as it were. You sort of need 3 hands for this. Now let's tighten that now by 50 degrees. So 30 degrees, 40, and just about in there. A little bit more there. And 50 degrees. Okay, so that should be okay. Right then. So the next job is the camshaft sensor must now be set between 1 and 1.2 millimeters from the back of the camshaft sprocket. So what you could use is a feeler gauge, but you'd obviously have to bend it almost permanently. So my thinking here is using a bit of soft lead, and I'll just hammer this to 1 millimeter or 1.2 millimeters. MINI says 1 millimeter and Peugeot say 1.2. So I've actually got it to 1.11, so that should be fine. Obviously if it's not correct, then we'll get a cam sensor error when we come to start the engine. So I've just loosened that, then I'll just try and bend this piece of lead. So it's got to go in there just between the sensor and the webbing of the camshaft sprocket. And then we sort of need to push the sensor in and tighten this up. Again, you probably need 3 hands or experience. Right, so that seems to be correct. Like I say, we'll soon find out when we come to start the engine whether we'll get an error code if that sensor isn't able to read the wheel. So then we just need to torque that up to 5 Newton meters. Again, that's only gently hand tight, and that's torques 20. Okay, so that's the sensor done. So the next job is to now replace the timing belt, and like I said in the beginning of the video, I'm reusing the original as it has only done 11,000 miles and it's about 2 years old, though ideally you'd put a new one on. And we just have a couple of photos here showing the different sprockets and the pulleys, and if we look further down there we can see the coolant pump and the crankshaft sprocket. And here is the auxiliary belt items when we come to put the other belt on later on. Okay, so I'm just going to rotate this sprocket so I can get the locking pin back in. I'll just be careful because it tends to spring and then it will overshoot. Okay, so that's back in. And while I'm at it, I better just connect that cam sensor before I forget. Just pop that back in there. I think there's a bracket for that. So the diesel fuel pump has to be locked in position as well. Technically speaking, I'm not sure why that is, but they give the facility to lock it, so you should. And obviously the camshaft needs to be locked, and obviously the crank at the bottom. Okay, so I'm dropping my original belt back in, and this is why I put all the yellow marks on. So in theory this belt is going back exactly as it came off. So really there shouldn't be a problem. I'm hoping there's not anyway. And as long as I put that tensioner back to the same position as well, hopefully all will be well. So we just get it over the crankshaft sprocket there. And it's just getting it around the tensioner pulley. So that's all now back on. So now to adjust the belt tensioner pulley. So this is how it was when I removed it. So the index arm must line up with the red alignment mark, or the lug. But that's obviously when the belt's new. So I'll go through the process as if it was a new belt. Now you might find a mirror quite handy here. There's not a lot of space. So if you can just poke a mirror in, and then it's a 6mm hex key to adjust the tensioner. So if I just keep checking that with a mirror, and then I can gradually bring that indexing arm up and down. So here we are. So there it is. It's level at the moment. So that's where it would be if it was a new belt. But mine was slightly poking down because obviously the belt had done 11,000 miles, so it's probably settled in a bit. So what I'm going to do is put it back down slightly to where it was. And there's a picture of how it used to look when I took it off. Now that looks pretty much the same to me. So for all intents and purposes, that should be as it was. So we now just tighten the tensioner pulley to 30 Newton meters, like so. And I can't see why there should be a problem now with that belt. I'll obviously find out if the engine works. Hopefully it won't suddenly shear in half or something nasty. Okay then, now to replace the crankshaft sensor and the belt protection bracket. So here's a quick photo showing the different angles of the crankshaft sensor and the head. Okay, so we've just popped this back in. I am somewhat confused why I seem to have a plastic plug on one of them. I'm not sure if that's actually how it's supposed to be or not. Seems a bit strange to me, but anyway. So we pop that back into position, and then this will be tightened with a 10mm socket to 5 Newton meters. So not very tight again, just gently tight really. So we just do that, and then I'll get a Phillips or posi drive screwdriver and just tighten up the top screw that I have in mind. And that seems to be in there. So the sensor head is just off from the magnetic ring that's on the crank pulley, or not necessarily the pulley, the actual disc there. Okay, and we'll just get our connector back in there, pop that in, so that's connected. And then we need to put the belt protection bracket in. So that just sort of slides in there. You can actually see sort of like the markings on that magnetic ring for the crank sensor. And then we tighten that up with a 7mm socket. Now I'm just going to tighten that up gently. That should do. Okay then. So now to replace the timing belt cover. So here's a couple of photos just showing the timing cover. So you can see all the different fixings on there. And you can also see the crankshaft pulley and the pulley bolt. Right then. So we're just try and drop that down there. Now obviously it's important you don't get any oil on the timing belt, so make sure everything's clean, and then very carefully pop that down. It's nearly in position, and it's 5 screws there and a 7mm socket to tighten those up. Access is obviously quite awkward, so I won't be using a torque wrench there, just lightly tighten those. And then we can remove the locking pins now. Now that one's jammed a bit, so I'm just going to take the tension off that and pull that camshaft pin out, and then finally the crankshaft pin. Okay then, so hopefully that's actually done. So now we've got the upper cover. Again, that's 5 screws, but we also need to put the engine bracket back on. So we'll tuck that in now while we've got access. That should just slot on there, and then we'll put the 4 bolts back in and then tighten those with a 16mm socket. And they will need to be torqued to 41 Newton meters. Get that done. There's 1, 2, 3 and 4. Okay, so now onto the top cover. So I have actually cleaned all this. We just slot that back in. So put the 5 screws back in there, speed all this up, and that's with a 7mm socket. And they're screwing into plastic, so don't over tighten those. And then we need to clip the conduit back on there, and also the pipe for the air conditioning refilling. It's quite tight, that was. There we go. Okay then, so now to replace the engine mount. So just have a few photos here to remind us of what the engine mount looks like when it's complete. And all the screws. Obviously there's my auxiliary drive belt tensioner, which is slightly broken there. But this shows you all the different screws and nuts for the engine mount. So the first thing to do is I'll put the mount to the body on, and these two screws here are tightened with a 13mm socket, and the side one is a 16mm. So we just whiz these in like so, and then I think all three of them are tightened to 68 Newton meters. So we get these two done each side of the mount. I think that's like a hydro mount there. There we are, and then just do that side one again, 68 Newton meters. And then the bridging part needs to go on. Now there are a couple of grades of bolts on these. I've got the 10.9 grade, and that would be tightened to 56 Newton meters with a 13mm socket. But there's also a slightly lower grade bolt. So that's my ones, which are 10.9, and the lower grade is 8.8, and they're tightened to only 38 Newton meters. So we get these in there. So that's a 13mm socket, and I'll be tightening them to 56. So we'll get our clicks done on that, and then we've just got the nut to put on, and that's an 18mm socket, and that one is tightened to 100 Newton meters. So there we are, 100 Newton meters. Trying to get the socket to fit there. It's definitely the right size. Not sure why that wasn't going on. And there's our click. Okay, so we can now release the trolley jack, and the engine is now back in the car, as to say. Okay then, so now to replace the crankshaft pulley. And remember, a new retaining nut must be used. So we need to just lock the flywheel again. So we'll pop our couple of little bolts in there and just pinch them up with a 10mm socket. So that should hold everything locked. So I'll take the old bolt out, which you should discard that, because obviously a new one must be used. And then line up the lugs on the pulley with like the keyway on the crank, like so. And then using your new bolt, put a bit of Loctite on there. I'm using red. It doesn't actually say in the manual whether to use red or blue, so I'm going to go with red because that's permanent. Assuming this actually should be really locked quite solid. So we're going to pop that in there. And again, we've got to do a torque tightening and then an angle tightening. So presumably this is a stretch bolt. So that's 35 Newton meters with an 18mm socket to do the initial torque, like so. And now we've got to set up the angle gauge again. These are so fiddly. I'm going to use a cable tie this time just to hold this in place. Obviously if it moved while you were doing it, it would be quite a disaster really, because then you wouldn't know how much angle you've put on. So I'm just going to mark it here. So it's 190 degrees for a new bolt. Now, like I say, I'm not actually using a new bolt, so I'm not going to go to 190 in case I snap it. So I'll probably take it to about 150, which is a complete guess. But hopefully that's going to still be tight, but not at the point of snapping in half. because sometimes you can feel the bolt as it starts to go soft, and you sort of think, oh dear, I've taken it too far now. But there we are, so that's back in. And like I say, if the car works fine and everything, I'll just drive sympathetically and not treat it like a racing car. So we just cut our cable tie off now. Remove that. And then we're back under the engine to remove our locking bracket. Then we just put our plastic cover back in there. Once we fiddle around a bit with that, it's like a little dowel at the top, just push that in. And then 10mm socket again for the old bolt. And just pinch that up. Like so. So I suppose what we should do now is actually turn the engine and make sure nothing hits anything, or it suddenly stops halfway, which would be quite disastrous. So thankfully the engine seems to be turning over fine. So hopefully everything is actually correct and the timing is spot on. Okay, so then on to some reference photographs which you can pause to view for longer. So we start with the warning label on that seal, which is quite important, that. And there we are, just before we were putting the seal on this side of the engine. And there's the seal installed. So hopefully that will keep the oil in there. And then the top cover, the inner cover, showing the brackets. And there's our camshaft wheel, the front and back of it. And there's everything ready. Our sprockets and pulleys. And there we can see further down there the water pump and the crankshaft sprocket. And then the alternator and the air conditioning pump there, and obviously our indexing arm for the alignment of the tensioner. And then here's our crankshaft sensor, the timing cover and the inside of the timing cover, and onto the engine mounts, showing the various screws and nuts there, securing all that together. Okay, and then finally this photo again of the engine mount. Okay, so you've been watching refitting the timing belt and engine mount on a 2009 MINI R56, and I hope this video helps you service and maintain your car within your budget. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in May 2022, and I can be found on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter as Coats and Gators.